Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Well, for this video, I should really just say physiologists because what we're focusing on here is the regulation of calcium. So this is one of our first real serious physiological processes that we talk about. And let's take just a few minutes to talk about the significance of calcium. So calcium has several roles in our body, including it's important for tooth health. Of course, we've seen it's important in making our skeletons hard. So I'm going to say hard skeleton. Or if you wanted to, you could say skeletal health. It's going to help to regulate heart rate. And we can abbreviate heart rate with an HR. And as part of that also, it's involved in the strength of cardiac muscle contraction. So calcium is important in regulating the heart rate and also the strength of that contraction. So clearly we know that the heart is important in pumping blood through our body. And so this is going to be an important job. Calcium is important in also blood coagulation. Coagulation is sort of like a fancy way of saying clumping. So this will be an important feature in our blood clotting process, which we'll learn more about in the future. We mentioned calcium was important in the strength of the cardiac muscle contraction, but it's actually important in any muscle contraction. Muscle contraction meaning skeletal muscle, so movements of the body, as well as smooth muscle contraction. So that would be, you know, movement of the digestive tract, for instance, or constriction and dilation of blood vessels, for instance. And then the last thing that we'll list here is regulation of nerve impulse. So two major ones that we'll talk about this semester are the roles of calcium in skeletal muscle contraction and the role of calcium in the regulation of nerve impulse. When we get into the cardiovascular system, then we'll talk about calcium as its role in regulating heart rate, strength of cardiac muscle contraction. We'll see its role in blood clot formation. And then, of course, this chapter, we've talked about calcium's job in making our skeleton hard. So we'll see all of that. If we talk about calcium regulation, we are going to see that the regulation is going to be a negative feedback mechanism. And remember, we introduced the idea of negative feedback mechanisms in chapter 1 when we talked about homeostasis. So another way we could title this whole video is calcium homeostasis. For me, whenever I teach negative feedback mechanisms, I always recommend for students to think about a figure 8. So we can have like a set point, so we can draw kind of a flat line. And then let's draw a line making a circle up away from that set point. So we're saying here, if in this case calcium is too high, we're going to bring it back down. So maybe we draw an arrow bringing that circle back to the line. So this is like the top half of our figure 8. And then if, let's say, calcium levels are too low, so we circle down below that line, we need to take action to bring calcium levels back up. Right, so this would be like the bottom half of our figure 8. And I think it's important to think about, you know, for me, I like to consider that figure 8 can be like really big if it's super dramatic, meaning if there's a really big variation away from our homeostatic set point. And sometimes the figure eight can be super tiny. So maybe it's a matter of like, I just had a huge glass of chocolate milk and I'm bringing extra calcium into my body right here this instant, and I need to do just a few fine-tunements to adjust that. Or maybe I took a walk and used up a lot of my blood calcium doing muscle contraction, and so I need to make a little bit of a fine adjustment just to fine tune that. So I think sometimes when we think about homeostatic mechanisms, we think on the big scale of like we're way out of balance and return, but sometimes I think it's just little tweaks. So I think that's important to mention when we do talk about our calcium regulation and our negative feedback mechanisms. We're going to see that there's three kind of areas, groups of tissues, body systems that are going to be involved. So we're going to have, of course, the skeletal system, which is why we're talking about this here in chapter 6. We're going to see the endocrine system is going to play a role here. So we'll actually talk about this mechanism again in the next semester. And we'll see the digestive system plays a role here as well. So we'll see these three body systems, really being in charge. When we talk about the skeletal system, of course, it has the job of either storing or releasing calcium. And I just like to remind students that, when we think about storage, the whole purpose of storing something is so you have it for later. So if you can put it in the closet, you can take it out of the closet, right? In case of the endocrine system, we'll see there are going to be some important hormone controls. And we've actually mentioned these hormones. We mentioned them in the previous video. So remember, we're going to be talking here about calcitonin. We're going to be talking about parathyroid hormone, which I'll abbreviate here, PTH. And we're going to be talking about calcitriol. And remember, when we think about our calcitriol, we can remind ourselves about vitamin D. And that can then help us connect into the job of the digestive system, which is going to be to absorb calcium from our diet. And so as we talk about calcium regulation, we're going to see what's happening with the bone. We're going to see which hormones are in charge of this mechanism. And then we'll be looking at, okay, are we absorbing or not absorbing calcium from our diet? Now, remember I said calcium regulation, that negative feedback mechanism could be like a super big figure eight or like a super tiny one if we're just doing a little tweak. So down here, we have, like the situations when we need to do like a super big figure eight. So we have the two extremes, hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia. So calcemia is, of course, referring to calcium. So hypo is below. So if you have hypocalcemia, you have low blood calcium levels. Low blood calcium levels. And if you're doing hypercalcemia, if that's the experience, hyper means above. So in this case, you have high or elevated blood calcium levels. Elevated blood calcium levels. Now, talking about these two extreme conditions help us to understand the overall significance of calcium regulation. When we talk about hypocalcemia, the effects in the body include blood coagulation. So here we're getting blood cells clumping together when we don't want them to. We're going to see effects in the heart rate, which I'm again abbreviating HR. We're going to have effects in muscle contraction. nerve function. And then we're going to have brittle bones, meaning that our bones are not hard the way they should be. And so they can just snap and fracture very easily. On the other side of this spectrum, hypercalcemia, if you have elevated calcium levels, this is also bad. So we'll actually see a decrease in our nervous system functions, which we'll see and feel as like a lethargy. We'll see sluggishness. We'll see constipation. And this can be connected with problems with muscle contraction, right? And problems with the nervous system, loss of appetite. Confusion. And it's at a worst case, we can see a coma, okay? So we don't have to actually fully memorize these effects of hypocalcemia or hypercalcemia. We're going to build our understanding as we go through body systems. But I think it's really helpful here to say, yes, regulation of calcium is important for the overall functioning and health of the body. So to really talk about blood calcium regulation, we're going to go through that negative feedback mechanism. And so as you can see here, what I've done is divided my screen, or, you know, like I would probably even divide my paper in half. And then I have one side that's looking at when blood calcium levels are elevated. So here I'm going to think about this as like the top half of my figure eight. So my blood calcium levels are too high, and ultimately I need to bring it back down. And then I have on the bottom half of my screen, blood calcium levels as too low. So in this case, my calcium levels have dropped and I need to bring them back up. If you want to do what I've done here, which is, you know, draw this line sort of in the middle of my screen, we can sort of label that as our calcium, our blood calcium set point. Remember, the set point is that like homeostatic standard for what we're expecting to see. Okay, so let us start. Let us start by looking at what happens actually when our blood calcium levels are too low. So we're going to actually start with that bottom half of our figure eight. And what we're going to see happening initially is we have sensors. It's important to remember anything that's regulated in the body has to be detectable by the body. So if we're regulating blood calcium levels, we have to have a mechanism where we detect, okay, what are those blood calcium levels to begin with? And so when our levels drop too low, we get a signal from the we get a signal to the parasympathetic, excuse me. We get a signal to the parathyroid gland. And the parathyroid gland is going to release, and here I'm going to make this an obvious color. We call this hormone parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So remember, PTH is our abbreviation here. The parathyroid hormone is being named because it's being released by the parathyroid gland, and that's essentially the job of the parathyroid gland. Now, remember, we talked about hormones going to the bloodstream and then going to target tissue. So in the case of the parathyroid hormone, we're going to be targeting 2 tissues. Now, we have really 3 choices when it comes to regulating. Let's actually go back up to this other set of notes, and let's add urinary system to our list of systems that are involved here, because the urinary system can either retain, that means keep in the body, or secrete, that means part of pee, calcium ion. So to be clear here, we have the skeletal system, which can store and release calcium. We have the endocrine system, which is the control. We have the digestive system, which can absorb calcium. And we have the urinary system, which can either retain or secrete calcium. So actually, when we talk about the endocrine system, what is it controlling? Who is it talking to? It can talk to skeletal, it can talk to digestive, it can talk to urinary system, specifically the kidney. Okay, so let's go back to our mechanism here. And we're talking about that parathyroid hormone, and we're looking at who does it talk to. So the parathyroid hormone can talk to your bone, and it's going to trigger an increase in osteoclast activity. We actually already in our hormone video talked about parathyroid hormone as increasing osteoclast proliferation and activity. And as such, remember the osteoclast is doing osteolysis. So when it does osteolysis, it's going to release calcium from the bone. So when the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone and talks to the bone, it increases osteoclast activity. Osteoclast activity, we know, is osteolysis. Osteolysis is the breakdown of bone. And so it's going to release calcium from the bone into the blood. And that's going to help bring up our calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone doesn't only talk to the bone, it also talks to the kidney. The kidney is the part of the urinary system, which is actually producing urine. And here we see 2 important things happening. One important thing that happens is that it's going to retain calcium. Meaning, instead of allowing the calcium to leave the body with the urine, it's going to be put back into the blood supply. So if you retain calcium, you're increasing your blood calcium levels. The other thing that we see happening here is that the release of the parathyroid hormone tells the kidney to increase the release of calcitriol. Calcitriol, remind yourself, is kind of like the hormone name for that vitamin D3. So all that connection we had with the integumentary system is true here. Now the calcitriol actually talks to the small intestine, and it triggers the small intestine to increase calcium absorption. So all that calcium from that big glass of chocolate milk is now going to be brought into the bloodstream. So when we're looking at this sequence of events, when we're looking at when our blood calcium is too low, it's all initiated by the release of parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is going to trigger osteoclast activity in the bone to release more calcium. It's going to tell the kidney to keep any calcium in the body, retain calcium. And then it also triggers the kidney to release the hormone calcitriol. And so we're seeing these two hormones working together, different ways, but same ultimate goal, same goal. And so the calcitriol then has a different target tissue. The calcitriol talks to the small intestine and triggers absorption calcium. Okay. Now let's say this was really effective and you've actually overdone it. You've actually increased beyond where you should be, right? You went way above the line, not even way above the line, just slightly above the line. So now what we need to see happening is, again, a return to set point. So again, anything in the body that's regulated has to have a way of sensing that. And so we have cells that are sensing that our calcium levels are actually too high. When your calcium levels are too high, we're working on the top of our figure 8. What we see happening here is our thyroid gland is going to release the hormone calcitonin. It's going to release the hormone calcitonin. And the hormone calcitonin is going to have, the hormone calcitonin is going to talk to tissues. So we're going to see calcitonin talking to the bone and talking to the kidney. So here's a pattern that we saw earlier. Now in this case, our blood calcium levels are too high. So we don't want the bone to release calcium from the body. Instead, we want to see the bone store calcium. And so what we actually see here is that we get a reduction of osteoclast activity. We get a reduction of osteoclast activity. And so rather than doing osteolysis and releasing calcium, we see that the bone cells, we see that the osteoblast activity just is busy. So instead of releasing calcium, we're going to store calcium. So we'll see no calcium released, osteoblasts continue to store calcium in bone. So that's reducing blood calcium levels. Okay, when we look at the kidney, we see that we have two effects. So one is to actually reduce the amount of calcitriol being produced. And then the other effect is to increase secretion. Okay, so if we reduce our amount of calcitriol, we're going to be reducing absorption at the small intestine. And so this is going to help to reduce calcium levels. So we are reducing absorption of calcium at the small intestine. So any calcium that you've eaten is just going to pass through. When we increase secretion at the kidney, what we're really saying here is that we're going to have calcium secreted in urine. And so that's going to also help to reduce That's going to also help to reduce our overall calcium levels. So when we're looking at the top part of our figure 8, when we have too much calcium in the body, that's going to trigger the thyroid gland to release calcitonin. So everything that's happening in the top portion, everything that's happening when our calcium levels are too high is being regulated by calcitonin. We get both bone and kidneys as our target tissues. At the bone, we're going to actually reduce osteoclast activity. So we're not doing osteolysis. So let's make a note of that. So we're going to say like stop osteolysis. That's how we're not releasing calcium from the bone. But the osteoblast activity continues. Osteoblasts are building bone. So we do see that calcium is going to continue to be stored away. When we see what's happening at the kidney, we are reducing the release of that calcitriol, effectively shutting down absorption of calcium from the small intestine. When we also see at the kidney, we're increasing secretion, that means we're actually causing extra calcium to leave the body in our urine. And so because we're storing calcium in our bone, we're not absorbing it from our diet, and we are getting rid of extra at the kidney, collectively then we're able to return our calcium levels to set point. All right, that's it for chapter 6. Yay! As always, take care of yourselves and each other.